Hello everyone. My name is Elise. Welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing so good today. We are doing my best books. I'm very excited. Of course, this is like one of my favorite videos to film every year. It's one of my favorite videos to watch, as is most people around BookTube. It's such a great recap of my reading year for me to look back at all the amazing books that I read. And there were a lot of amazing books that I read in 2023. I think in total, I don't normally talk about ratings on my channel, but I do rate them for myself. So when I'm looking back to make this type of video, I can see which ones kind of rose to the top that I should be looking through. And for 5-star reads this year, I had 21 5-star reads, which is really good for the amount of books that I read. And I'm so happy with that. I was also able to make this list pretty quickly. There were 9 books that really stood out for me that rose to the top. And then that 10th spot, there were a few contenders for, but I feel really solid about the one that got put in there. And I went with my gut decision. So I tried to be really snappy about it, not overthink it. Just went with my intuition, ranked them really quickly, and it still feels good to me right now. So we will start getting into the books. If you have read any of the books that I'm about to talk about, please let me know down below what you thought of them. Really interested to see if you also love them or if you have other thoughts. And hopefully, if you have not read them, this will interest you in some way. This book I read fairly recently. It was in Nonfiction November, and it is a piece of nonfiction, and that is Drowned City: Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans. This is written and illustrated by Don Brown, and it's published by HarperCollins. This is a work of graphic nonfiction, and I'll show you a little bit of the art style there. It is done in color, and this book really hit me when I initially read it. It's one of those books where as soon as I finished it, I was like, whoa, that was a great book. No questions asked. It didn't need to settle with me or anything like that. It was just a fantastic book, and it has stayed with me since I initially read it in November. This book follows the prelude as well as during and after Hurricane Katrina hit, and it shows the injustices that were happening during that time, a lot of the failures and lack of accountability from government entities, whether that be politicians or whether that be FEMA and the emergency response organizations. And it names names. It is not pulling any punches. A very scathing take on the way that people navigated this situation in positions of power, and I appreciated it for that. I also think this does a really good job balancing the darkness of humanity, which you definitely see during this time, but also the lightness of humanity and the way that people show up for each other, definitely neighbors helping neighbors, people risking their own lives to help other people. And I think that balance and nuance is really important to show, because it isn't just one or the other. All of those things were happening during this time. And I think it's an important part of our history to acknowledge and make sure we do better from, and really appreciate this for that. So I'd highly recommend this to anyone and everyone. It's also very slim, so you can read it pretty quickly. This author has another graphic nonfiction like this out about the Dust Bowl, and I'm really looking forward to picking that one up in 2024. So that is Drowned City. Would highly recommend. Next up, we have the very first book that I read in 2023, and it has stayed on my best books of the year list all year long, and that is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. This is published by Knopf. This book follows a couple, Yejude and what's his name? Akin, and they are married, and they are trying to have children, but they're struggling with infertility. Because they're struggling with infertility, they start getting pressure from Akin's family that he needs to take a second wife. They're in Nigeria, and it wouldn't be uncommon for him to take a second wife, but they had previously had a conversation that polygamy is never something that they would participate in. They're very much against it. But the pressure becomes so much that Akin does take a second wife. That's not a spoiler, it's in the blurb, so you know that going in. And this really starts to fracture their marriage in a major way. It handled the theme of infertility really well. This book, I think, is just an all-around wonderful package and has mass appeal to so many readers, and that's for a couple different things. Firstly, I think the characters are really well drawn. They're so believable and they're really complex. They make good decisions, they make bad decisions, they make feelings with their heart and with their head. They're just wonderful characters to get to follow. Secondly, I think that the themes are done very well. This is definitely tackling hard themes because lots of things come up when you talk about infertility. It's talking about Philyaw, like what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a woman in her society that doesn't have kids. For Akin, it's talking about what it means to be a provider and what it means to be a man. And there's a lot of gender dynamics going on in this book that are really interesting as well. It also talks about the pressures of your bigger family and your in-laws and all those types of things. And the other part of this that I was very surprised by and think gives it mass appeal as well is the plottiness. This book is so plot heavy. There are a lot of twists and turns that are happening within this novel. I was shocked and surprised numerous times, and it is page turning because of that. So this book I really think could be read by almost anyone and they would enjoy it. Again, look at the trigger warnings just to be sure, but I get why so many people love this. I am adding to the voices of people who love this and really think this is a winner all around. So that is Stay With Me. And from my first book of 2023 to my very last book of 2023, and I finished it on December 31st, so it was just in the nick of time. That is Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren. This is translated from the Swedish by Agnes Broome, and it is published by Astra House. Now, this book I read partially because it's so long, and I'm trying to read Picante Beef Baby's books over 500 pages in the year of 2023, and I was trying to pack in a few at the end. This one came to my attention because the lovely Jo Smith had commented at the midway point of the year, I think, that this was their favorite book of the year so far. And since then, I've had multiple other people tell me that they really loved this, and the blurb did sound up my alley. So this follows a number of characters, but you're getting the perspective of only two of them. So the characters that you are following are Martin Berg and his best friend Gustav Becker, and then his, at some point, wife. He meets her along the way, you see their relationship, they get married. Her name is Cecilia, and they are very much a trio. They represent a lot of different aspects of academia and the creative life, and they really are dependent upon each other in certain ways, but also very unique and clash in certain ways. And I think those dynamics are really interesting and fun to read. Then we get a present day timeline that includes Martin and Cecilia's children. The other perspective that you're getting to read from, besides Martin's, is Rockel's, which is his daughter. She's in her early 20s at the time that you're getting her perspective, and he also has a son, but we don't get his perspective. So this book is constantly flashing back to the trio in their earlier years, and then flashing forward to Martin and Raquel and the family in the present day. Now, the main driving plot of this is that Cecilia, at some point when the kids are young, disappears. This is in the blurb. You're meant to know this from the very beginning. You don't really understand why Cecilia disappears. So throughout the novel, that is the central mystery that the characters are orbiting around, and you, as the reader, are orbiting around. Now, I think this book does so many interesting things. I could talk about it for a really long time, so I'll try and just mention a few. One, I think the characters are so intriguing. I was mesmerized by the characters. I just kept wanting to come back to this book, and I read this over a full month, so I really spread out the reading experience, and I would definitely recommend that if you're going to read this. It allowed me more time to chew on the characters' personalities and their decisions and the ways that things were linking together over time in a way that a fast read I don't think would allow me to do. This book has some really interesting mirroring from the beginning of the book to the end of the book that I absolutely loved. If you're reading the book, once you finish, go back and read the first page again. So fascinating. And I also think that for such a character-driven novel, I really felt the propulsion to move forward, and I'm not even sure why. I think part of it is you are left in the dark and confused in a lot of regards, so you feel this desire to get more information, just like the characters do. It does a great job of putting the reader into the shoes of the characters, which I think is a difficult thing to do, and loved it for that experience as well. There were so many interesting conversations that we get to witness between the characters that speak to grief and speak to belonging and not belonging, that speak to loneliness and hardship and joy. And there's so many good things in here that if it was a smaller book, it definitely wouldn't have been able to accomplish. So highly encourage people to pick this up. There are so many other things to talk about, but we can talk about them in the comments below if you want to know more. So that is Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren. Next up in my number 7 spot is Milkfed by Melissa Broder. This is published by Scribner, and it was a year of Melissa Broder for me. I read 3 Melissa Broder books this year, The Pisces, Milkfed, and Death Valley. Milkfed was definitely my favorite. This one follows our main character, Rachel, who is 24 years old and is really struggling with an eating disorder. And I do think the representation of that is really well done in this novel. It talks about disordered eating and eating disorders in such a raw way, to use a word that's maybe overused. It does it by putting you in the mind of someone who is so in that experience that you get all of the cringy thoughts with the devastating thoughts, with the hopeful thoughts. And I love when we can see that wide scope of experience for a character. Now, the plot of this starts happening when the main character, Rachel, meets another woman. What is her name? She meets a woman named Miriam one day at a frozen yogurt shop who is in a larger body, really loves and accepts herself, and is really embracing her sexuality. And this starts them on a somewhat platonic, somewhat sexual relationship. I know I've said this before in reviews of this, but this book is very bisexual, so if that is a good thing for you, then you might really enjoy this book. And I just loved it so much. It was gritty and funny and sharp, and I do think this is Melissa Broder at her best. So if you want to read Melissa Broder, I think this is a great place to start. And we adore that cover. So that is Milkfed. Next up, in number 6, another book that I read in December. And this is why I always wait a little bit to film this video, because 2 of my December books ended up in this list. And at number 6, we have The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deeshaw Philyaw. This is published by West Virginia University Press. And oh my God, this is as good as everyone says that it is. It is a short story collection that is following Black women and their desires in one way or another. A lot of them, it's subversive, so they're trying to break out of these boxes of niceness and politeness that they feel pushed into and that are harmful to them in many ways, and they just want to get out of that. They are interconnected in certain regards, and I really enjoyed that reveal kind of throughout some of the stories. This was one of my 5-star predictions. It, of course, was 5 stars. It lived up to all of the hype. Each story was absolutely amazing. I was doing this as a buddy read, so I rated the individual stories. All of the stories were 5 stars except for one that was 4 stars, which is like unheard of for me in a short story collection. I never love the majority of the stories like that. So this really is just absolutely fantastic. Some of my favorite stories were JL and the very popular Peach Cobbler, which I know a lot of people love. Those are 2 of my favorites, but everything in here is good. If you're interested in slice of life short story collections that are centering longing and desire and new love, stuff like that, this is a great pick for you. So The Secret Life of Church Ladies, chef's kiss, so good. Next up, in my top 5 now, at number 5, we have a shorty, and that is Who Killed My Father by Edouard Louis. This is translated from the French, let's see, by Lorin Stein, and it's published by New Directions. Very slim. This is also nonfiction, and it is about the author's experience with their father growing up over time, leading up to their death, and he is really blaming the death of his father on systemic problems in France specifically for him. And this is another one of those nonfictions similar to Drowned City, where this book names names. It is calling out specific politicians that have backed bills and legislature that have affected his father negatively and contributed to the shortening of his life. A lot of this has to do with the class system specifically in France, but it's also talking about other systemic things that are happening. We have some really great conversations and thoughts about toxic masculinity in a way that I haven't seen presented before. And he talks about how that has passed down from his father to him in certain ways, and the ways that he's seen that play out in his father's life and his own. I just love this book. There were such unique takes on certain things that I've read a lot about, but have sort of maybe gotten complacent with. And I really enjoyed this, like, reinvigorating for me on some of these topics. And yeah, it just packs a punch. Really recommend this to people. I think a lot more people should read it. Plus, this cover is absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, will not forget Who Killed My Father anytime soon. Number 4, we have another nonfiction, and that is Happening by Annie Ernaux. This is published by 7 Stories Press, and this one is translated from the French again by Tanya Leslie. I also had a year of Annie Ernaux. I read 4 Annie Ernaux books this year, and they were all amazing, let me tell you, but I only wanted to put one on my best books of the year list, and I do think this might still be my favorite. This story is about her experience trying to get an abortion when she's younger in France when it is illegal. And the thing that I've always said I love about her writing style, she writes mostly nonfiction that is memoir-esque about her life, and she has such a sparse writing style that I think translates so well for the genre that she's writing in. And it's just very much like her thoughts put on a page, her experiences put on a page. She does such a good job of remaining as objective as you can be about your own life. I can't imagine how hard it would be to write some of these things down in the way that she is writing them. I often also talk about the lack of adjectives in her writing, which again, I think delivers that sparseness, that sharpness, that really seemingly objective eye, even though I know it's not 100% objective. But yeah, it's just such phenomenal writing. Plus, I think the subject matter of this is what makes it my favorite of hers that I read so far. This is so not about liking her or not liking her. It's so much more than that. It really does transcend her as an individual person. And it's just crazy to me that she can make it feel that way. So yeah, love this book, as most people do. I've really loved everything I've read by her, and definitely pick this up. I do think this is a good place to start if you're going to read Annie Ernaux. It was the first one I read by her, and stand by that as a good decision. So thank you to Past Me. But yeah, loved Happening. It's really stuck with me. Some of the scenes still live in my head, and it's very evocative that way. So Happening. Next up, we have, I sound like a broken record, another nonfiction. And in my number 3 spot, we have Osebol. This is Voices from a Swedish Village by Mait Kapla, and it's translated by Peter Graves. It is published by Alan Lane, and this is also a chunkster. I think this is over 800 pages or something like that. And this is told in interviews, so this is a little bit of the style. It reads quickly because there's not a lot of words on the page. This is the author interviewing people, residents of this town in Osebol, which is a very small Swedish village that is on the brink of extinction, so to speak. So over the years, the infrastructure for this village has declined, and less people are able to live there over time. So these interviews, I think, span like over 50 years with the residents, and it really just is her talking to the residents about their everyday lived experience and writing it down in this book. The thing that hit me the most about this book and why it was so high on the list for me is I just couldn't shake the piece of history that this is and will continue to be, even as this village grows smaller and smaller. And eventually, you know, in 100 years from now, there's probably going to be no one left in this village. And this will be what exists of the experience of that village. And that like touches something in my soul so deeply. I loved getting to experience the perspective of the people living here, a perspective that is so different from me in a lot of regards, but also similar to me in human experience in a lot of ways. It really did make me feel connected to the global humanity, let's say, and there is something sentimental in me that just connected and resonated with that. So I adored this book. I always wanted to pick it up when I was reading it, even though it's very long, and would really encourage people to take a look and read about an experience that is different and yet similar to yours. So that is Osebol. And we're in my top 2. So I will say, every year in my list, I do have a few books that rise to the top. And these 2 are definitely the ones that did that for me. Last year, I think I had 3 books at the top, and this year it's 2. The distinction I typically make for these are like the books that I just talked about are favorite books of the year, absolutely. And the 2 books I have left are favorite books of all time. If that helps you contextualize where they're at in the rankings, then hopefully that's useful. But number 2 on my list was The Wall. This is by Marlon Haushofer, and this one is translated by Shaun Whiteside, and it's published by New Directions. Got a gorgeous cover. Also on the back, it has a landscape that's beautiful as well. This was my favorite book at the midway point, and between this one and the top one, I really struggled, but I do feel like it's a really solid number 2. This follows a woman. What's her name? I don't know if she's even named. I think I did this last time. I don't think she has a name, but she's on vacation in the Austrian mountains, staying at this little hunting lodge with two of her friends. They go out one day to have a dinner together and don't return. When they don't return, she starts to investigate to try and see where they might be or what might have happened to them. And she discovers that out of nowhere, an invisible wall has been erected around her and the property that she's living on. And you get all of this through a diary or a journal that she is keeping. It does flip back and forth in the timeline a little bit, but mostly chronological, I would say. And it just gets into how she is now going to survive by herself behind this wall. That already as a premise is very intriguing and I think will appeal to a lot of people. This isn't necessarily a dystopian that's going to be very plotty. It's pretty quiet, but I think it has a couple amazing things in it. The first is the thematic integration. So this one, as there is an invisible wall erected, her journals really contain a lot of information about the gender constructs that trap women, especially at this time. And I think the wall is a great metaphor for that. It's a very feminist novel in that sense. And I think talked about it in a way that felt so modern and relevant still to today, that women often get forced into these roles that they don't want to be in. And that can feel very isolating, very much like entrapment, and that is what this author is experiencing in a very physical way. And you get her exploring some of the ways that that's happened for her emotionally as well throughout her journals. I absolutely adored that aspect of it. I also absolutely adored the nature writing in this. Obviously, she has a lot of time to reflect in this journal, and the landscape of this book, the square footage that we get to experience for her, although small, is so richly described. It is viscerally imprinted upon my brain. I read this in the first half of the year. I think I read it in February or March, and I can still describe every detail of this pasture, this land that she is living on. It is so well written, and I absolutely loved it for that. So this book I could gush about all day. Definitely a favorite book of all time. Highly encourage anyone to read this if they're interested in it, because it is phenomenal. So that is The Wall by Marlon Haushofer. And coming in at my number one, you already knew what it was going to be. This is The Book of Eve by Carmen Boullosa, and it is translated from the Spanish by Samantha Schnee, and it is published by Deep Vellum. Look at this cover. I've said this so many times. This was my most anticipated fiction release of 2023, and I am so happy that it lived up to the hype for me. I am the reader for this book. This book was written for me in so many ways. The premise of this is it is a retelling of the book of Genesis from the perspective of Eve. Now, Eve has said that the book of Genesis is not the true story. That story has been worked over and manipulated by men, particularly Adam, and she is here to tell the truth. Oh my God, this book I could also talk about for ages. There's so many interesting things happening in this book. The format of it is really structured like Genesis, so it's told in books and then chapters within those books, and it's told in parables. There are footnotes and other works at the end of each book that contain other perspectives, almost like notes about the things that she's talking about. So the mirroring of the format of this to the format of the Bible itself, fascinating, brilliant, so much to dive into there. Then there's the theme of truth in this, which I think is so fascinating and really well done in a lot of different layers. So there's layers of truth, basically what is the truth? Is the truth even real? There's discussion about that, and who gets access to the truth and who gets access to writing truth. fascinating. Then there's this structuring throughout the novel of truth being linked to desire for women. And that was really interesting in and of itself. There is a portion of the novel where Adam's voice really gets elevated and he is spreading a lot of lies about her, and her desire totally drops during that time. And then as she starts reclaiming her voice, you start to see her desire coming back, which I think is such a good parallel to today. I think a lot of things about women's desire are marred in myth and falsehoods, and that can lead to women feeling broken, or like they have really low desire and no desire at all. It's hard, I think, for women to access pleasure, and that is in part due to all of this misinformation out there. So I loved the linking of that. I think that the parables are really interesting stories. Like, one is about the formation of the clitoris. That is fascinating. The world building in here is really cool, and a unique take to world building that I don't typically get to see. There's just so many fascinating things in here. I think that Carmen Boullosa is a brilliant mind. I'm so excited to read more from her. I have a couple of her other books now, and this was just so clever and beautiful and angry and sad and hopeful. Oh, it just elicits so many feelings in the reader and is really thought-provoking. A wonderful combination for me. And please, please pick this up if it sounds interesting for you. I know this will not be a book for everyone, but it was a book for me, and I think this definitely has an audience out there. So that is The Book of Eve, my #1 book of the year. So we have made it through these top 10 books, and I will say, interesting notes at the end from previous years. Some unique things about this year's list for me is, one, the amount of nonfiction. So I have 4 nonfiction books on this list, which is a lot for me to have on my best books of the year at the end. Plus, in my top 5, 3 of them were nonfiction, which I think is just wild. Also, my top 5 are all translated. It's all translated literature in the top 5. In the top 10 in general, there's 6 books. So the majority is translated, which I think is another fascinating and wonderful thing. So yeah, I don't know what that means, but just interesting to note. Please let me know what your favorite books of the year were. I'm very intrigued to hear. I love reading people's favorites at the end of the year if they sound like they would be for me. So let's talk about it in the comments down below. Here's looking forward to a lovely reading year in 2024, and I will see you all in another video. Bye.